I was born on July 22nd in 1822 on my family's farm in what was then Heisendorf, Austria. I always had good grades. After my graduation, I enrolled in a 2-year program at the Philosophical Institute of the University of Olmütz. Distinguished myself academically, particularly in the subjects of physics and math, and graduated from the program in 1843, that same year against my father's wishes, who expected me to take care over the family farm. I began to study to be a monk. I joined the Augustinian order at the St. Thomas Monastery. In the monastery, there were facilities to do research. In 1853, I finished my studies at the University of Vienna, where I learned physics, mathematics, and botany. Around 1854, I began to research the transmission of hereditary traits in plant hybrids. At the time of my studies, it was a generally accepted fact that the hereditary traits of the offspring of many species were merely the diluted blending of whatever traits were present in the parents. It was also commonly accepted that over generations a hybrid would revert to its original form, the implication of which suggested that a hybrid could not create new forms. However, the results of such studies were often skewed by the relatively short period of time I decided to use peas for my experiments due to their main distinct varieties, and because offspring could be quickly and easily produced. I developed a model of heredity mostly recognized as the pea plant experiment, in which I observed its height, tall v short. I observed that when tall plants were self-pollinated or cross-pollinated with others like them, plants in following generations were all tall. When the short plants were self-pollinated or cross-pollinated with others like them, the plants in following generations were all short. However, I also observed that if true breeding tall low plants are crossed with true breeding short plants, all the next generation of plants called F1 are all tall. When I showed the self-pollinated F1 plants or cross-pollinated with other F1 plants produce an F2 generation with 3/4 of the plants tall and 1/4 short. So, to sum up, my model basically states that each trait is controlled by a pair of hereditary packets we now call genes. One packet comes from each parent. The alleles of the gene for height are the same in true breeding plants. Crossbreeding uppercase TT with lowercase tt plants produce uppercase T lowercase t plants in the first or F1 generation. The F1 plants receive a uppercase T allele from the tall parent and a lowercase t allele from the short parent. The F1 plants are tall because the uppercase T allele is expressed and cover up the lowercase t allele. So, the uppercase T allele is called dominant, and the lowercase t short allele is called recessive. The gene for each trait comes in different forms, which are now called alleles. Because genes come in pairs, an individual can have the same allele or different alleles in a gene pair. If the alleles are the same, the individual is homozygous for that gene. If the alleles are different, the individual is heterozygous. In an heterozygote, one allele, the dominant, may cover up or hide the expression of the other allele, the recessive. Genes are often named by a letter that stands for the dominant trait. The dominant allele is capitalized and the recessive is in lowercase. In 1856, I started a project to investigate inheritance patterns. Although at the beginning of the research I used mice, I later changed to peas from the garden, and I used them as my main reference system because peas were cheap and easy to obtain. They also took up little space and had a relatively short generation time. I studied the inheritance of 7 different characteristics in peas, which were pea shape, pea color, flower color, pod shape, pod color, shape in which they grow, and stem size. Then I crossed them with a different trait and observed how the traits were inherited. I realized that in the first generation after crossing them, one trait always predominated over the other. I called the visible one the dominant trait, and the hidden trait the recessive trait. In the second generation, the recessive trait reappeared in a minority of plants. There were always approximately 333 plants that showed the dominant trait for each plant that showed the 111 recessive trait. I also noticed that the traits were inherited independently. After carrying out the experiment and drawing my conclusions, I was able to conclude three things, which later became laws. 1. When individuals of pure races are crossed, all descendants of the first generation are equal. 2. When crossing the individuals of the second generation, the characters of the parents are shown according to the 3-to-1 ratio. 3. Hereditary characters are transmitted independently of each other. I yielded three laws of inheritance: the law of dominance, the law of segregation, and the law of independent assortment. Each of these can be understood through examining the process of meiosis. The law of dominance. A dominant trait is a trait whose appearance will always be seen in offspring. In other words, dominance describes a relationship between two alleles. If an individual inherits two different alleles from each of its two parents and the phenotype of only one allele is visible in the offspring, then that allele is said to be dominant. Mendel's law of dominance states that if one parent has two copies of allele A, the dominant allele, and the second parent has two copies of allele A, the recessive allele, then the offspring will inherit a capital A, lowercase a genotype and display the dominant phenotype. The law of segregation. A parent may have two distinct alleles for a certain gene, each on one copy of a given chromosome. Mendel's second law, the law of segregation, states that these two alleles will be separated from each other during meiosis. Specifically, in the second of the two-cell division of meiosis, the two copies of each chromosome will be separated from each other, causing the two distinct alleles located on those chromosomes to segregate from one another. The law of independent assortment. Mendel's third law, the law of independent assortment, states that the way an allele pair gets segregated into two daughter cells during the second division of meiosis has no effect on how any other allele pair gets segregated. In other words, the traits inherited through one gene will be inherited independently of the traits inherited through another gene because the genes reside on different chromosomes that are independently assorted into daughter cells during meiosis. I was not interested in heredity as such, but in the role of hybrids in the generation of new species. Also, the monastery gave me a lot of resources to make this discovery. Now, to explain better how traits can be inherited, Reginald Punnett created a system called Punnett square. The Punnett square allows to observe each possible combination of genotype, where the dominant and recessive alleles are expressed. It is a chart that consists of locating the traits, the dominant one with a capital letter, and the recessive one with the same letter but in lowercase. They are placed vertically and horizontally depending on the genes of the parents. The picture is filled according to the two letters. In the end, the possible traits can inherit are obtained.